everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar on DAC7. There have been a lot of changes to the e-commerce ecosystem when it comes to VAT, and there is no shortage of changes to come. Today, we are going to discuss how the new DAC7 obligations will impact businesses. To introduce simplyvat.com, we are an international VAT service provider assisting e-commerce retailers and beyond to comply when trading in global markets. We can assist with VAT registration, VAT returns, and individual consultancy work. My name is Alex, and today I'm joined by our senior indirect tax researcher, Louise, who will be guiding us through the changes. Hi, Louise.
Hi, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got 30 minutes to go through the DAC7 and what it means for sellers using marketplaces in the EU. So as Alex was saying a few minutes ago, there's a lot of changes when it comes to VAT, especially with the e-commerce ecosystem. So I hope this is going to be helpful to anyone selling on marketplaces in the EU and wondering how the DAC7 might affect them. So without...
Just to jump in here, we have a chat section on the right-hand side as well. So if you have any questions before the end of the session, Louise is going to be answering a few questions at the end. So feel free to use the chat box to the right of the screen. You can drop a little hello in there just to say hi, and then we'll be picking up those questions at the end. Thanks, Louise.
Fabulous. So, okay, let's start then. So the agenda for today is to, as I said, cover what the new DAC7 reporting obligation means for marketplaces, but also for sellers using marketplaces to carry out sales of services and goods in the EU. So we'll be covering the following topics today and trying to answer the following questions. What is the DAC7? Which supplies are reportable? How do marketplaces are currently complying with the DAC7? How are marketplaces preparing for these new obligations? What it means for seller, and how you can prepare and what to do next when it comes to the DAC7. So to start with, I wanted to cover what it actually means. What's the DAC7? So the DAC7 is a Council directive on administrative cooperation in the field of taxation. It's basically the implementation of the OECD model reporting rules for digital platforms and requires digital platforms to report details on the income of sellers that they make through their platforms, and this report is submitted to tax authorities, but also to sellers so they know what is being communicated to tax authorities. It's called DAC7 because it's basically the 7th amendment to this European directive, and it extends the scope of the automatic exchange of information between member states. It's a European-wide annual reporting obligation, and it will apply to European-based, but also non-European online platforms if they facilitate supplies in the EU. And it's basically a framework on how the information collected by marketplaces has to be exchanged between countries. So when does it actually take effect? Well, technically, it's already it has already taken effect because European member states were due to transpose the DAC7 into their domestic law by the end of 2022. And the first report is due to be submitted by marketplaces by the end of January 2024, which is why we're talking about this today. And this is because the first report will be in respect of sales and transaction data taking place in 2023. So the first report is due by the end of January for transactions made in 2023, which is why it's a hot topic at the moment. And as a result, we've seen marketplaces communicating about the DAC7, asking sellers to upload their details, publishing information about the DAC7 and what it means for them. So the DAC7 introduces a new concept of what we call a reportable seller. The DAC7 targets those reportable sellers, and a reportable seller is a European resident individual or a company using an online platform to carry out reportable activities in the European Union. They can also be non-European individuals or non-European businesses who rent out properties located in the European Union. There is also a threshold of sales not to exceed to become a reportable seller. It means that if you are a European-based individual or company and you are making sales exceeding 2,000 euro in a year, or maybe you've made over 30 transactions in a year, then you become a reportable seller. So there is a threshold to look out to know whether your activity will be reported and communicated to the tax authorities or not. And specific supplies are covered under the DAC7. Typically the sales of goods, so that's typically for e-commerce sellers, sales of goods, the provision of personal services as well, the rental of properties, that can be house sharing, but also the rental of sharing transport. The DAC7 covers domestic, but also cross-border supplies. And this is regardless of the status of the seller. So as we've been saying, a seller can be a private individual or can be a business, an established business. And as we can see, it covers a large amount of supplies from goods to services. So if you are selling bundles of supplies in the EU, then you would also have to look at combining those to calculate your thresholds. Some sellers are excluded from the DAC7, but also some marketplaces, some platforms. So it doesn't apply to everybody trading in the EU. You also need to look at whether you are maybe a platforms or maybe you use a crowdfunding platform and you might think that you are perhaps within the scope of the DAC7, but the DAC7 actually excludes a number of stakeholders. So typically, casual sellers, a casual seller would be a seller that has been performing fewer than 30 sales in a year, and for which the total payout does not exceed 2,000 euro in this reporting period. So you might perhaps make a couple of sales, but they go over the threshold, then you would become a reportable seller. But if the sales are below the threshold, then you would not be a reportable seller. That means that the marketplace would not collect that information on you, would not give that information to tax authorities. Certain platforms are also excluded from the DAC7 scope. Typically, investment platforms, crowd lending platforms are excluding payment services providers. So payment services providers who are merely just providing payment services as a result, they are not within the scope. So certain platforms only redirects users and buyers and consumers to other websites, and they only list or advertise products or services. So these types of platforms are outside of the scope. Public entities, governmental entities can also be excluded from the scope of the DAC7. And then wholesale chains and tour operators with a high frequency of renting of accommodation are excluded as well. So this is to mitigate the impact and the burden of these reporting obligations. So tour operators are not including, as we've just said, and casual sellers as well. We can imagine that it can be a burden for marketplaces to have to report information on all small sellers using their platforms to sell on. So that's why these thresholds were put in place. So how does the DAC7 works in practice? So we've been saying that it's a report that is due to be submitted by marketplaces themselves, not by sellers. What's going to happen, or what is happening already, we've seen marketplaces getting ready for the DAC7, is that marketplaces and online platforms operators are due to collect and verify the necessary information on all their users making use of their platforms to supply goods and services in the European Union. Marketplaces have become responsible for identifying reportable sellers. So we've just said what it is to be a reportable seller. If you are within the scope, then the marketplace will identify this based on the information that they have on you as a seller. And then every year, the marketplaces or platforms will file a report. This report will be given to you so that you know what information is being given to the tax authorities. And then it's also going to be submitted to tax authorities. Generally, a marketplace will have to submit the report to the tax authorities of the country where they are resident or established. It happens that marketplaces are not based in the European Union, and in that case, then they can choose where to submit the report. Some countries have agreements as well, mutual agreements, so they can also just submit the report from their home country, and then this will be exchanged with the tax authorities as well. What does the report include? Well, it includes the income earned by sellers, which has been made on their platform, and it's being reported in a single member state. And the whole idea behind the DAC7 and the DAC, this directive in general, the whole idea behind it is that European member states will be required to exchange the reported information within a certain deadline, so that then they can cross-check information submitted. So I think that's a big takeaway is with the DAC7 is the whole point of it is that member states are gonna basically exchange information that is submitted. So it's no longer countries working in silos and not exchanging data. This is all about exchanging data, exchanging how much income sellers are making in the EU when they trade to European consumers and when they supply services. So very important point, I would say, to remember from today. So we've just been saying that marketplaces will be collecting information on sellers. So what kind of information is collected? Any information that's relevant when it comes to making sure that VAT is being paid and that sellers are complying with their tax obligations. Typically, the identification details of the sellers, including their tax numbers, VAT numbers, where are these sellers based and established, an overview of the amounts that have been paid out to sellers when they use a platform to supply goods and services, and that includes any commissions and platforms, fees. So all that overview is also being reported to tax authorities. And certain sellers are reportable because they supply rental accommodation or they rent property in the European Union. So for those types of sellers, the location of the immovable property is also relevant and will also be given to the tax authorities as well. So we've been saying that this DAC7 is already in place. It's not a new thing. This is something that member states have had to transpose into their domestic legislation as of the end of 2022. In fact, recently, the European Commission sent out some reminders to certain member states, to a couple of member states that have failed in providing information on how they transpose this directive in their domestic legislation, the amendments that they've made. So we've seen that some countries have been called out on this, and they need to hurry up in making sure they communicate on how they have transposed these DAC7 amendments into their legislations. But this is because data is already being collected in 2023. We've just said that the first report is going to be in respect of sales made in 2023. So marketplaces have already been preparing for the DAC7. They're already collecting information. They're putting processes in place to collect that information. We've seen a couple of marketplaces, large ones, the ones that are mostly used, the biggest marketplaces that I'm sure you all know about. These have already been collecting information on sellers. They've been warning sellers on the consequences if a seller fails in providing and submitting and uploading the correct information. And that can result in their account being deactivated. That can result in the payouts to be withheld from the marketplace until a seller complies with the requirements from the marketplace. And this is because penalties can also apply if a marketplace fails in complying with the DAC7. So that's why it's quite important. And we've seen that they are pushing for sellers to be on top of this and to upload the correct information on their platforms. So why does it actually matter to sellers? Why are we even having this webinar, and why does it matter to sellers using marketplaces in the EU? So something I wanted to highlight is that the DAC7, it doesn't create any new tax obligations for sellers. It doesn't mean that you have added VAT obligation or VAT liability due to the DAC7. It's not about adding and creating new obligations on you as a seller using a platform, using a marketplace in the EU. But it does mean that it gives more transparency and more tools to European member states to check whether you as a seller, you are complying with your existing liability and complying with your existing VAT liability and VAT obligations. So what I would say that it means for you as a seller, if you are listening to this webinar because you sell on a marketplace and you've heard about the DAC7 and you are unsure about how to prepare and what it means, is that you should be complying, you should already be complying with your existing VAT liability, because this is going to be an increasing focus for tax authorities. So the DAC7, it matters because it gives more information to member states. It's an increase of information sharing between member states. So it means that audits are more likely in the future. I think this is something that we can really expect. Member states will have more scrutiny, more opportunities to open audits and ask questions. The DAC7 it gives more transparency, and it will help tax authorities to assess and compare income tax and VAT in the future. So we can expect that from 2024, when the first reports are being uploaded and sent out to the tax administrations, then these will be checked against income tax, VAT, and tax authorities will be able to ask more questions. Importantly as well, it gives more ability for member states to open joint audits on cross-border sales of sellers. So we've been talking about this exchange of information, really important, and the DAC7 is all about helping member states to exchange the income information between sellers, especially for cross-border activities. So we can expect that member states will be working more together on audits, asking questions, sending out inquiries to check that sellers are complying with their international VAT obligations. And I think it really matters because it gives a really good example of the increasing key role that marketplaces and online platforms are having or are being given when it comes to tax compliance and when it comes to tackling VAT fraud in general in the EU. We've seen lots of measures and new regulations recently in the last few years in the e-commerce sphere, new rules for marketplaces when it comes to VAT collection. I'm sure if you are listening to this webinar, I'm sure you are aware that in the last couple of years, the e-commerce VAT package was introduced, and it gave marketplaces more VAT liability and more responsibility when it comes to tax compliance and VAT collection. And I think the DAC7 really is a good example of that increasing role that marketplaces have when it comes no longer to the VAT collection and payment, but also to controlling and making sure that they authorize the sellers using their platforms, and they know that their sellers are compliant, and they know that the sellers using their platforms know about their VAT obligations, fulfill their VAT obligations. And I think that's it's important for anyone selling on a marketplace in the EU. So I wanted to conclude the presentation with what's the next steps, in my opinion, if you're a seller, even if you're a marketplace, or if you are thinking of selling in the European Union. There's some next steps that you can take and some things to keep in mind for the future. I would say that the first step is to really look out for the notifications from the marketplaces when they ask you to upload correct information on your account. We've seen that Amazon has been asking sellers to submit correct information by the end of October this year. And I think this is really important. So step number one would be to really make sure your information is up to date and correct on your online stores, and that you do reply when a marketplace is asking you to upload correct information. I would also say that it's important to start reviewing now what your VAT obligations are, making sure that you are up to date with them. When you have a liability to collect and remit VAT in the European Union, are you doing this correctly or not? Because when the DAC7 reports are being submitted, then, as we've just been saying, tax authorities will have the tool to be able to cross-reference and check the data submitted in January against your VAT return. So making sure that you're completely on top of your VAT obligation, that you're not missing out on anything, that you're collecting the right VAT amounts. And if you're unsure, then do ask an expert about this. This is something that we help businesses with at simplyvat.com. We help sellers reviewing their VAT obligations. Perhaps you've got some backdated liability that you are unaware of. Maybe you've been charging incorrect VAT rates. It's been quite complicated since the e-commerce package came into place. There's been a lot of confusion. So we come across sellers every day who are confused about what their VAT liability is. So making sure you're on top of this, and it's your responsibility as a seller to know your tax obligations when you trade in the EU. I would also say that you need to keep your sales record for 10 years. And this is in case of audits. Since the introduction of the e-commerce VAT package and the new OS and IOS, we've been seeing more audits coming through and more questions from tax authorities asking to review the sales, asking questions, asking sellers questions. So I would say really keep records of your sales. Make sure that you are prepared in case of an audit and in case of questions from tax authorities, so you're ready to answer them. And if you do get asked questions, or if you receive any letters from a tax authority, do not ignore that. Do not ignore any questions if you're confused, because it can be really daunting. And sometimes it's in a foreign language, so we know that it's a bit tricky to know what's going on. Then you don't have to deal with this on your own. You can always reach out to any experts. VAT experts, they are there to help you navigate these types of challenges. And then the last thing I wanted to say as a next step and how to prepare for the DAC7 is to really keep an eye on any other VAT changes affecting the digital economy. So we said that the DAC7 is, I think, part of a broader landscape of VAT changes in the EU affecting online sales, e-commerce sellers, marketplaces. It's all part of a plan to make the VAT rules more suitable for the digital economy. And as a result, there's been a lot of changes in the last couple of years. And the European Union is also planning to introduce further changes in the next few years. And I would say that if you are currently trading in the EU, if you're using marketplaces, if you're using the OS, the IOS, or if you're thinking of using the OS or IOS, then again, really keep an eye on any changes affecting the VAT liability. There's lots going on. And if you're unsure, you can always contact a VAT expert and ask questions. But yeah, keeping an eye on anything's going on, because there's more changes coming in the future, and it's always your responsibility to be aware of these. Ignorance is not an excuse when it comes to taxation. And yeah, there's lots of exciting changes happening. So this was my take on the DAC7. I hope that was helpful. I hope that gave a good overview of what it is. And now we're going to take a few questions. We've got 5 minutes left, so we're going to take a few questions. And if we cannot answer any questions, then you can always
get back to us. Yeah. We have actually gotten quite a few great questions coming through. So if you have any other ones, like Louise mentioned,
Yes.
pop them in the chat. If we can't get to it in the next few minutes, then we will reach out to you separately. So first one is from Mark here. Does the platform owner or the seller have to make the report in January? So who is actually reporting this to the tax authorities?
Yeah, so that's a really good one. So it's down to the platform operator to submit the report to the tax authorities. However, if you are considered a reportable seller, the marketplace will also send you what they are sending to the authorities. And they will have until the end of January to submit this to the tax authority. So it's not down to you as a seller to take action of this. The only thing you have to do as a seller is making sure that your information is up to date, it's correct, and that you are on top of your VAT obligations.
Perfect. Thanks, Louise. Okay, a question from Robin here. Will they share historical data, say going back a few years, or is it just looking at 2023 for the January reports?
So that's a really good question. So officially, the first report is with regards in respect of 2023. However, if there's a big, I can imagine that if there's a big discrepancy of data, or if the tax authorities are suspicious, then maybe they ask to see they could ask questions. That typically what can happen in case of an audit is that tax authorities can become a little bit suspicious if they think that there's something unusual maybe about the data, or they're not sure that the seller, they seem that it's something, there's a discrepancy, then they could ask for information and open an audit on previous years. But to answer your question, the DAC7, the first report, is only in respect of 2023. So the marketplaces are not going to submit information in respect of previous years.
Perfect. I think that clarifies it. And especially when we look at audits as well, the audits that come through, each country will have their own time period where they can go back and look into your accounts. So it is best to make sure your accounts are always up to date in case you were to ever be audited. You always want to comply. Okay, we're going to go to Nita here. Does the DAC7 apply to retailers who sell on their own web store?
No, it doesn't, because the whole point about the DAC7 is that it's an obligation that falls on marketplaces. So if you are using your own web store, then this is not within the scope of the DAC7. If you are a marketplace operator and if you facilitate sales on behalf of underlying sellers, then you would become within the scope of the DAC7. But if you only sell on your own web store, then that's not considered. You're not a marketplace, or you're not a platform. And the DAC7 is purely a reporting obligation on digital platforms. And this is because historically, with the rise of e-commerce, what the European, or what lots of jurisdictions are trying to do is to have more transparency on sellers. For many years, there's been sellers being able to sell through large marketplaces without collecting taxes, without remitting taxes. And this is precisely what the tax administrations are trying to have more transparency on. So no, the DAC7 only applies to marketplaces, and it doesn't apply to retailers selling on them on web store.
Perfect. Thank you. We also have another question here from Nita. What if a seller is selling on multiple marketplaces? Who is doing the reporting, and does the threshold on each marketplace, is it applied separately or holistically for the seller?
So that's also a good question. So my understanding from this is that because every marketplace has got that obligation, and they are responsible to do their checks and identify their sellers using their marketplaces, it will apply if you use different marketplaces. Every marketplace will identify how much sales you make on their platform. So if you sell on multiple marketplaces, then the thresholds don't apply separately. It's how many sales you make and how many transactions you make on a single marketplace, and that's going to be reported. So basically, you can't try to somehow split your sales so that you're still under the thresholds. It's how much you make on a single marketplace separately, rather than as a whole if you sell in a single country.
That makes sense. Thank you. And we have a final question here, Robin. I'm just going to sum up your two questions here because I think we can answer all in one. So what about payment processing platforms like Stripe, WorldPay, and Braintree, etc.? Do they have an obligation to also share data? And I think, Louise, you have some interesting insight on this as well from your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically these types of platforms, if they only supply payment services, they are not within the scope of the DAC7. However, I also want, it's not about the DAC7, but there are payment service providers requirements coming into place as well in the future. So although the DAC7 does not apply to payment service providers, I would say to also keep an eye on what's happening in the EU at the moment, because there are other obligations, reporting obligations, being introduced in the next few months. So yeah, if that's something that you are conscious about or you're concerned about, so do keep an eye on this, because that will apply if you search CESOP, then yeah, you should be able to find more information about this. And again, it's not a VAT return as such, but this new obligation on payment service provider will be closely linked to VAT return and tackling VAT fraud in the EU.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think that's about all of the time we have today. I'm just going to pop our email here. If you have any questions about the DAC7, about your VAT obligations, if you're complying, or if you have specific questions that you want us to tackle in another webinar in the future that might be facing your business, we're happy to take requests to see how we can help businesses trade internationally compliantly. So please pop your suggestions in the comments or in the comments below the video. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you guys soon. And thank you so much for attending today. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you. Bye.